So this talk is a little bit titled somewhat off a little bit because we wanted to title this in connection to the paper we published on the potential of using free flight for parrot conservation releases. And so this project, we use the parrot free flight techniques and knowledge and to release 6 blue and gold macaws into Brazil. And that's what I'm going to cover here. These slides are available to view at Facebook, the Bird Recovery International Facebook page, which you can see on the screen here. Parrot Conservation will take you there, or Bird Recovery International will take you there on Facebook. So the slides are available to view in detail. And also, if you want to see a video of the birds that we released in Brazil, you can go to palmsforparrot.org, and that will take you directly to a YouTube video, mini documentary on the birds that we released in Brazil. So to summarize the project, we took 6 baby blue and gold macaws that we purchased from breeders, commercial breeders in Brazil in 2022, May, April, June timeframe. And we raised them to become wild birds, and they are all 6 today, living and surviving in an area where there have not been any blue and gold macaws in over 50 years. So the only birds in the area, blue and gold macaws in the area, are the birds that we released there. And we have photos and documented the birds currently alive and well since then. Part of the objective of the project was to demonstrate that birds raised in captivity, the issue is not so much they're raised in captivity, but the issue is how they're raised in captivity. The concept of free flight, training parrots to fly outdoors as pets, has been experienced and create a lot of knowledge that we could then apply to the release process, which is what we did in this project. We took Umberto. We had 3 key players in this project. We had Don Bright-Smith, who was the expert on parrot conservation. Umberto's a university biology professor in Brazil, one of my students who was training and flying several 3 blue and gold macaws and several conures, so he's experienced with the process. And then I was the behavioral person on the project. And we raised the baby birds, started out, got them at an age where they were not quite fully feathered, and we got them in 2 groups of 3. The first group was starting to fly in the mobile aviary. We had an aviary built on a trailer and moved it into position at the release site, about 7 meters in length, 2 meters wide, and they were starting to fly in the aviary when I arrived. And the second group, when they arrived, they were not yet flying, and they started to fly in the aviary while I was there. So anyway, we started by, as you can see here in the photo, Umberto is giving them a little squirt of hand feeding formula. So we started by getting them to walk back and forth across the perch to get a little squirt of hand feeding formula. Then we got them hopping across a third of a meter between 2 perches to get a squirt of formula. And then we increased the distance to a meter back and forth. They were hopping back and forth to get a squirt of formula. And we increased the distance over several days, about a meter at a time. It's kind of interesting to watch their mental development progress or stop them from progressing until the mental development had advanced a little bit, and then they could suddenly say, oh, I can do 6 meters, I can do 3 meters. I couldn't do 3 meters yesterday, but I can do 3 meters today. Anyway, we got them flying the full length of the aviary, about 7 meters, within about a week. And then we started asking them to fly from a perch outside the aviary back inside the back of the aviary about 2 meters. And we began expanding that distance. So we had this learned behavior pattern of flying back and forth between the perches, which they continued to do when we moved the mobile perches outside the aviary. And we continued to increase the distance that we had about 30 meters at one point, but ultimately began practicing at about 15 to 20 meters on a regular basis. And what this achieved was this helped the birds develop some basic flight skills so that they were flying in autopilot mode. In other words, their conscious mind didn't have to think about the action of flight. They were doing it in autopilot. Like when you walk, you don't think about where you put your feet. That's what we needed them to do, get to that stage. And so as they were flying back and forth to the perches, they began thinking about where they were going instead of how to get there. And at some point, after about a week of flying back and forth like this, they began not landing on the perch and circling around the area, landing back on the aviary or landing back on the perches. And they began expanding their skills. While they were in the aviary, we did have 3 adult blue and gold macaws that were Umberto's pets that were free flight trained, housed in a smaller cage in the aviary with them for a few days. And then we had them loose in the aviary all together. And we were going to use those birds to help give them a flock experience, which they did initially for a few days. Once they started flying and circling and flying with the adults, they did fly with the adults for a few days. But we ran into a small problem of the adults flying 10 kilometers to Umberto's mother's house where they live. They found their way home to the home location, and then they began bringing the babies to that location. So we wound up pulling the adults from the project and allowed the babies to continue. But they did get a few days of flying where they had startle flights initiated by the adults. They had flocking flights with the adults. And so they began learning the basic flight skills and survival skills in the release environment. So their instinctive tendencies were being calibrated to the actual release environment instead of being calibrated to life inside a cage, which was part of the objective. So we got the birds flying back and forth. We would pick them up and carry them by picking them up by their feet and carry them inside or outside the aviary as necessary. We did not do any social interacting with the birds. We didn't cuddle them or pet their heads or anything like that. We did nothing to discourage human interactions. We were relying quite heavily on a process that I've experienced many times with pet parrots when I'm raising pet parrots, what we call the dispersal phase. When they become teenagers, they're supposed to move out and go start their own life. This occurs about the time they learn to feed themselves, and they will separate from the parents, and that will sever the parental bonds at that point. That also will sever the human bonds at that point. I've had birds that were very human socialized try to turn wild on me because I didn't give them attention during that time frame, and we were expecting that process to sever the human connection, and it did that quite well for us. We had one bird that came to us, number 3, was a bit over socialized, more so than the others before it came to us. The breeder was giving him a lot of attention. That bird wanted to be, was especially interested in human interactions. We, of course, didn't give it those interactions, but it was captured by some local workers and taken to their hometown about 30 kilometers away. We believe that the bird was not eating the food they were trying to feed it because we were feeding them hand feeding formula and pellets. We were not feeding them local foods at that point. And so because they couldn't get the bird to eat, they turned it over to a rescue who called us, and we got the bird back, and we put it in the aviary with another of the younger birds for a few days, let them get re-socialized, and then opened it back up and let him fly again. And that bird is now again living as a wild bird since then. So we were successful in that respect. That dispersal phase process is a bit vulnerable because if anybody feeds the animals during that time frame, they will identify humans as a food source, and that can mess up that dispersal process. But as long as nobody feeds them, it will sever the human bond. So we did nothing otherwise to decrease the human interactions that way. You can see the area where we're releasing. You can see the aviary. It's a small aviary, 20 feet long, or 7 meters by 2 meters. Let me think what else there is that I want to touch on here, because I know there's going to be some common questions. Probably the most common question that we have here is the imprinting issue. And Again, that is dealt with through the natural dispersal phase. I rely quite heavily in this process on the fact that the birds have the natural instincts. When they grow up in the wild, those instinctive tendencies are going to develop over time. Most people think of instinctive tendencies as instinctive behaviors as being something that you're born with, ready to go, fully formed. And there are some truly innate behaviors, but very, very few. Most instinctive behaviors go through a process of being developed over time. And during that process of being developed over time, the environment is also influencing that behavior. So you have a calibration process that takes place. So if the bird grows up in a cage, those instincts are calibrated to life inside that cage, which is why we wanted to grow up flying outside from the very beginning, so that those instincts become calibrated to that particular release environment. And that's what this process was built around. And today we have 100% survival of all 6 of the birds. I will comment that our team was extremely effective. I believe one of the reasons our team was so effective is because we had some extremely knowledgeable people, but not, we didn't have any kind of like a power struggle. Our team was a very cooperative, very cohesive, very effective team, because we all had our respective places, and it worked out very, very well. Umberto's a walking encyclopedia of plant knowledge, and he knows the area and the behaviors well. Don's knowledge of conservation and plants also, and my behavioral experience with free-flying parrots just really worked together as a very effective team. And I think we can see the results prove that out. And I'll just call it that as a summary, because I think that covers everything that I wanted to cover as a summary of the project. And open it up for questions.
Thanks very much, Chris. There are a couple questions in the chat. Did you monitor them after release? If so, how and for how long?
Yes, we put number tags on them. And so one of the things that made this project work was Umberto was able to take a 1-year sabbatical. And so he was able to continue with the, so we initially hand fed them in the aviary, and then we have feeding stations in the aviary. So we allowed the birds to come back into the aviary to eat pellets. And once they were weaned off the formula, they would come back into the aviary every day to eat pellets. And after a while, we began putting natural foods in there, local foods in there, and began weaning them off the pellets and getting them eating the palm nuts and so forth. And so we were able to observe them on a daily basis for pretty close to a year that way. And then Umberto periodically goes down and photographs and observes the birds since then. Plus, there are local people who live. There's a small farmhouse there that there are local people who observe the birds on a regular basis and report to Umberto that they're sightings of the birds and their activities. So the only birds in the area are the birds that we release. So it's pretty easy to monitor them because there's 6 blue and gold macaws where there haven't been any in over 50 years.
And recently they've moved to a small farm only about 3 kilometers away, and every now and then I'll go out and check on them. But they seem to be doing well.
They've come back and they're now hanging out at the original release site. They spent some number of months in mango season in a mango tree some kilometers away, but they've come back and are, at this time they're hanging out in the original release site area.
Cool. And then there's a question, do we use specific kinds of training like food training, predator training, or is free flight training kind of different from that?
Well, the whole concept of what we do with free flight training that we applied to this project is recognizing that the animals have the instinctive tendencies, and they will develop those abilities if they're placed in the proper environment at the right age and the proper sequence of environments. So we can put them in select environments that allow their natural abilities to progress sequentially and increase the complexity of the location. And through that process, they will encounter They will first off start out encountering scary birds that are not actually dangerous. Okay, so they might see a vulture, or they might see some other large bird that it at first appears scary, and they will respond to that with a predator evasion behavior, even though it's not actually dangerous. And through that practice, they will develop and fine tune their predator evasion practices so that when they do encounter an actual predator, they have fine tuned and developed those behaviors already. We don't have to teach those. We just put them in the right environment, develop the flight skills, develop the physical fitness, develop the natural awareness of their environment that just naturally occurs. And all those behaviors will develop naturally, the same they would with a wild bird that grows up in the nest.
Okay, so there's two more questions. The first one I can probably answer. Did they become wild birds? And I would say they haven't had any supplemental food or water for almost a year. Well,
Over a year. 2nd of December was a year.
Over a year. And they're surviving out there. They're sticking together. They haven't started to breed, but they are young. So if you count survival and no supplemental food as becoming wild birds, I would say they're pretty close. They don't go near people. They don't approach people closely, so pretty good.
They're basically responding the same way a wild chick would grow up and develop the behaviors and function from that age, the same as any wild chick would. I would argue that they are just as wild as any wild chick that was hatched in the wild.
The only thing they may not know is the history, the culture of where to fly around in the landscape. What their parents might teach them, but other than that, their behaviors are
which is something we were hoping that our kernel flock was going to be able to do, but because the kernel flock started taking them to town, that was something we had to pull from the group, because we were using pet birds that knew the area better than we realized. We didn't initially expect them to fly 10 kilometers. This is to discover how to fly home 10 kilometers, but they did figure it out on their own.
Yeah. And then for the last question before we end, Roshan is asking, what were the flight exercises and how did you encourage the birds to make the flights in the beginning?
Simply getting them to walk back and forth across a perch to get a little squirt of hand feeding formula, and then hop across from one perch to another about a third of a meter to hop over to that to get a squirt of formula. It was purely based on back and forth to get feeding, which we did 3 times a day. We would feed them 2 or 3 times a day. I don't remember now. On the one of the things you can see here when you go to the Facebook Bird Recovery International page and look at these, you can see a example of the journal page that we collected data on, so that you can see the progression, just a sample of how the progression was logged of the type of behaviors that we were measuring and keeping track of. And so you can see how they naturally progress down this sequence of behaviors that we expected them to develop and how we were logging that. And so we initially started out logging them just flying a short distance between 1 or 2 meters. And, started out just turning around on a perch, then hopping 6 inches for a food and 2 feet for a food. And we just simply progressed that behavior back and forth to a perch, to 2 different perches to get that little squirt of food. That's all we did.
Okay. Thank you very much.